Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 29 March 2024. It is the 129th anniversary of the birth of Ernst Jünger, who was born in Heidelberg on this date in 1895. He served in both world wars of the 20th century and lived himself more than a century. I think he was 102 years old when he died. Many books were published in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, examining every aspect of the war. And Ernst Jünger's Storm of Steel was one of these books. It was a memoir of experiences of the war with very little in the way of commentary or explanations. André Gide, who was himself a great literary stylist, wrote in his diary, quote, Ernst Jünger's book on the 1914 war, Storm of Steel, is without question the finest book on war that I know, utterly honest, truthful, in good faith, unquote. Probably it was these qualities that Gide mentioned that made the book so popular. Storm of Steel proved to be Jünger's springboard to interwar literary fame. It was among the earliest of the memoirs, not the first. I think the first was published 1917, but this was published immediately after the First World War. And it brought him considerable renown, not immediately, but the sales built over time. Jünger, together with Oswald Spengler, were considered the two most influential figures of the conservative revolution in interwar Germany. Jünger because of his Storm of Steel, and Spengler because of his Decline of the West, which was published just before the war ended. Jünger wrote many subsequent articles and books, not only looking back over the past war, but looking forward to the consequences of war and its implications for the future. Although World War I was a catastrophic experience of industrialized warfare that almost no one predicted or expected, many who participated in the war, when reflecting on their experience, realized the technologies that were deployed in World War I were only imperfectly used, and that industrial warfare has a rationality of its own that had not yet been fully realized in the First World War. In a couple of previous episodes, my episode on the bombing of Dresden and my episode titled Wars and Rumors of Wars, I mentioned the Italian general Giulio Due, who foresaw the use of air power to expand a war behind enemy lines. In the US, Billy Mitchell conducted a demonstration to prove that air power could sink capital battleships, and this was also to be prophetic of action during World War II. Heinz Guderian in Germany and J.F.C. Fuller and Liddell Hart in England saw the possibility of combined arms operations in mechanized warfare, and so became the prophets of what came to be known as Blitzkrieg. During the interwar period in Russia, Georgy Isserson developed the concepts of operational art and deep battle, both of which would be highly influential. I don't know what Isserson's experiences were in World War I, but given that he was born in 1898, he was alive to have witnessed that war, and it has been suggested that Isserson was influenced by reading Heinz Guderian's book, Achtung Panzer. It has often been claimed that World War I largely consisted of stagnant trench warfare because doctrine and tactics hadn't yet caught up with the new technologies that were made available in the war. In the interwar period, that is to say, after the First World War and before the Second World War, intensive work was done on mechanized warfare doctrine, and Jünger was part of this work. But Jünger's work went far beyond military doctrine and developed political and social themes relevant to the new kind of warfare that was revealed by the First World War. The translator of the Penguin edition of Storm of Steel, Michael Hoffman, writes in the introduction to that book, Jünger was, quote, Jünger was recruited by Mittler and Son, a noted publisher of militaria in Berlin, and wrote more books on the war, including the viscerally, as well as headily unpleasant treatise on battle as an inner experience, of which I could not bring myself to read more than the excerpts I read years ago in a book on German history, unquote. There has, rightly enough, been a tendency to focus on Jünger's later fictional work. He became an acclaimed author who won many prizes, as much for his fiction, or perhaps more for his fiction than his nonfiction, rather than focusing on the disturbing interwar writings. But these interwar writings are interesting precisely because they are disturbing, because they call our presuppositions into question in a more radical way. They make us uncomfortable. One of these interwar books, or essay, if you prefer, was an essay titled On Pain. And there is now a helpfully annotated translation of this into English by David C. Durst. I was interested to learn that On Pain was written in Goslar am Harz, where I have visited, to where Jünger had retreated because of threats to his life at the time. On Pain is a singularly unforgiving book. Jünger begins it, quote, "Pain as a measure of man is unalterable, but what can be altered is the way he confronts it. Man's relation to pain changes with every significant shift in fundamental belief. This relation is in no way set. Rather, it eludes our knowledge and yet is the best benchmark by which to discern a race. We can observe this clearly today, since we have a novel and peculiar relation to pain in a world without binding norms. Through examination of this new kind of relationship to pain, we now intend to secure an elevated point of surveillance from which we may be able to catch sight of things still imperceptible on the ground. Our question is, what role does pain play in the new race we have called the worker that is now making its appearance on the historical stage?" Unquote. Jünger's inquiry into pain bears some resemblance to contemporary Japanese philosopher Masahiro Morioka's conception of painless civilization, which also considers the human relationship to pain in terms not unlike Ernst Jünger's. It would be worthwhile to read Morioka in light of Jünger or vice versa. In a preface to On Pain, written by Russell Berman, the relationship between Jünger's comments on photography and Walter Bonneman's famous essay on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction is noted. And it's very characteristic for Jünger to discuss a transformative technology like photography. Of photography, Jünger writes in On Pain, quote, "The photograph stands outside of the zone of sensitivity. It has a telescopic quality. One can tell that the event photographed is seen by an insensitive and invulnerable eye. It records the bullet in mid-flight just as easily as it captures a man at the moment an explosion tears him apart. This is our own peculiar way of seeing, and photography is nothing other than an instrument of our own peculiar nature. Photography, then, is an expression of our peculiarly cruel way of seeing. Ultimately, it is a kind of evil eye, a type of magical possession," unquote. So we see there in that passage both the disenchantment of the world and the enchantment at the same time. It's an unnatural way of seeing. It's an artificial extra organ, the camera that is. But at the same time, he says it's kind of evil eye or magical possession. So there's a dialectical tension between the artificial and the natural in the form of the term I just used from Max Weber. I've already forgotten it. Jünger wrote extensively on the many new technologies that transformed the battlefield. We could, with some justification, call his work as much a philosophy of technology as a philosophy of war. The intersection of war and technology is to be found in the concept of the Materialschlacht, the battle of material. Materialschlacht became a talking point as one of the distinctive features of industrialized warfare. Walter Bonneman's review of Jünger's Total Mobilization included a reference to, quote, the new warfare of technology and material, unquote. The importance of technology for the war effort and the emergence of Materialschlacht as a distinctively technological form of warfare was widely interpreted as dehumanizing, as the war itself was seen as dehumanizing. In Materialschlacht, the production of war industries and the technological mastery of the tools of war is seen as being as important as, or more important than, mere personal courage and martial spirit. But as I discussed in my Wars and Rumors of Wars episode, this emergent form of technological warfare in turn resulted in the emergence of technologically adept heroes of mechanized warfare, an Achilles of the Materialschlacht, if you will. So while we can see the Materialschlacht of industrialized warfare as dehumanizing, we can also see it as the boundary condition for an emergent form of heroism distinctive to mechanized warfare. Something qualitatively new had appeared in history, and this novel emergent generated a cluster of other emergents for which mechanized warfare was the boundary condition. We can also think of Materialschlacht in industrialized warfare as the pervasive infiltration of personal courage and martial spirit throughout a society and an economy in a condition of total mobilization. In other words, not only the soldier, but the workers in industry who design and build the machines of war and the directors of industry who organize war production become or can become heroes of Materialschlacht. Also, technology shapes war, and as we've seen, war shapes history. Industrial warfare is an emergent form from industrialized society, and as war accelerates technological innovation, this technological innovation feeds back into society and accelerates social changes, so that a more industrialized society is an emergent from industrialized warfare. One of the themes of Jünger's essay, Total Mobilization, and his book, The Worker, Dominion and Form, which is an expansion of his essay on total mobilization, is this infusion of what you could call martial spirit or heroism throughout an entire society. In my episode on Wars and Rumors of Wars, I mentioned Jünger's essays, Total Mobilization, and I argued that Clausewitzian total war required total mobilization. For Jünger, this total mobilization transformed society, and we can see how, in the present context, that new forms of social organization, new forms of society also emerged from the boundary conditions of industrialized warfare. In their 2017 paper, Ernst Jünger, Total Mobilization and the Work of War by Bogdan Kostea and Kostas Amaridis, they write, quote, Jünger grasped that something new had emerged from these endless battles of material. He shows how the domination of technological death had begun to change the ethos of war among soldiers. In permanent danger of being simply used up in the consumption of raw materials for the production of mechanical destruction, they understood the historical essence of the war. They no longer saw themselves as soldiers, but as machine operators, as workers claimed by the mechanical logic of a line of production akin to that of the factories manufacturing these infernal devices, unquote. Kostea and Amaridis in their paper emphasize the role of the soldier in mechanized warfare as a worker of destruction in the industry of war. This is a peculiar realization of what Edith Weisgerab called a man-made mass death in her book, Spirit and Ashes. The soldier as a worker of destruction with an emphasis on the man-made character of mass death is what you could call a curious inversion of the idea of homo faber, not man the builder, but still man the worker, only now man the worker at destruction. But even here we can see how heroism emerges in a distinctive form in the midst of this mechanized destruction. Recall that the Soviet Union used to decorate heroes of socialist labor Mikhail Kalashnikov, for example, was one of the recipients of this award. Since the true heroes of the workers' paradise would, of course, be workers. Feats of labor productivity were organized for propaganda purposes, which came to be called Stakhanovite, named after the coal miner Alexei Stakhanov, who began the Stakhanovite movement and who was, incidentally, featured on the cover of Time magazine in 1935. While the Soviet Union represents a very different ideological vision for society than that of Ernst Jünger, Jünger's book, The Worker, Dominion and Form, celebrated the worker in a surprisingly similar fashion. And Jünger was aware that his celebration of the worker could easily be mistaken for communism and materialism. In fact, that was because the book was viewed as leaning too much toward communism was one of the reasons he had to get out of Berlin and go to Goslar. And he addressed this quite directly in a 1927 essay. Quote, "Worker doesn't mean the same thing as the working class, a term of historical materialism invented by the burgher and the university professor," unquote. And in the next paragraph, he writes, quote, "The worker in the new sense means a commonality of blood of all workers within the nation and for the benefit of the nation. Only this commonality is capable of overcoming the ugliness of capitalism," unquote. But for all his emphasis on technology, on workers, and Materialschlacht, for Jünger, war was ultimately a spiritual calling. Quote, "No, war is not a material matter. There are higher realities to which it is subject. When two civilized peoples confront one another, there is more in the scales than explosives and steel. All that holds of any weight is in the balance. Values are tested in comparison with which the brutality of the means must, to anyone who has the power to judge, appear insignificant. A strength of will, all embracing and concentrated to the last pitch in the highest untamed expression of life, asserting itself even in its own annihilation, is brought into play," unquote. And in a 1925 essay on mechanized warfare, he wrote, quote, "It was already during the Battle of the Somme when man found himself at his limit. And then the sons of the materialist age suddenly realized that in reality there was nothing that a man couldn't withstand. There was no such technology that could rival spiritual strength. We were convinced of this countless times. This fact was proven by every unknown soldier who had passed through all the horrors of military technology and placed his indestructible, sturdy heart on the scales. This is when it became apparent that what was important is man, not technology," unquote. One of the reasons I wanted to emphasize the possibility of individual heroism in the context of the dehumanizing conditions of mechanized warfare, as well as the spiritual dimension of warfare that was recognized by Jünger, and which Walter Bonneman called depraved mysticism, was to explicitly contrast Jünger with Hannah Arendt. Arendt's influential analysis of totalitarianism is essentially the idea of the lonely crowd. Probably the best part of the origins of totalitarianism is in the final sections of the book, where she distinguishes isolation, loneliness, and solitude. Arendt calls isolation pre-totalitarianism. That is to say, it is a condition of totalitarianism, but not itself totalitarian. It's loneliness that is, for Arendt, crucial to totalitarianism. Quote, "Loneliness concerns human life as a whole. Totalitarian government, like all tyrannies, certainly would not exist without destroying the public realm of life, that is, without destroying, by isolating men, their political capacities. But totalitarian domination as a form of government is new in that it is not content with this isolation and destroys private life as well. It bases itself on loneliness, on the experience of not belonging to the world at all, which is among the most radical and desperate experiences of man," unquote. Arendt mentions Jünger in passing in The Origins of Totalitarianism, but she does not embark on any detailed analysis of his work. In one mention of Jünger, she footnotes the following with a bare reference to Storm of Steel without plucking out any particular part of it. Quote, "The worshippers of war were the first to concede that war in the era of machines could not possibly breed virtues like chivalry, courage, honor, and manliness," unquote. I'm making the precisely opposite argument, that in fact, the worshippers of war, if that's what we're going to call Jünger, which is what Arendt wants to call Jünger, were emphatically making the case that courage and honor were an integral part of mechanized warfare. Although, as I mentioned several times in my Wars and Rumors of Wars episode, it's a minority experience. It's not the mass experience. It's the exceptional individual who experiences this. Further, I would make the counterfactual claim that if Arendt had taken up a detailed analysis of Jünger's work, especially the essay Total Mobilization and the book The Worker, Dominion and Form, she would have assimilated this to her overall critique of totalitarianism, with the society prophesied by Jünger construed as either proto-totalitarian or as outright totalitarian. So it's again, Arendt did not do this. She did not engage in a detailed reading of Jünger, but when you read Jünger and you read her side by side, they are each criticizing the other without naming the other. Obviously, Jünger was before that, although he lived. They were contemporaries, but his interwar books were written before Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. Jünger anticipated a critique of his work that would deny individuality in the society he envisions, reducing everyone to an isolated dependence upon institution. And here's a quote from The Worker. Quote, "From the moment when form shapes one's experience, everything becomes form. Form is thus not a new dimension to be discovered in addition to those already known. Rather, to a new gaze, the world appears as a theater of forms and their interrelations. To point out an error typical for the period of transition, it is not a question of the individual disappearing and only being able to derive meanings from corporations, communities, or ideas as higher order units. Form is also represented at the individual level. Every fingernail, every atom in him is form," unquote. So it is because the individual exemplifies form that heroism remains a possibility in industrialized civilization. In the passage I just quoted and throughout the books, Jünger is using the word form in a distinctive way. And here is how he defines it in The Worker. Quote, "We will call form those dimensions which become visible to an eye capable of grasping that the world is held together by a law which is more decisive than that of cause and effect, yet without seeing, however, the unity under which this integration is achieved," unquote. Jünger also employs his conception of form in a sententious definition of history. Quote, "History is form inasmuch as its content is the destiny of forms," unquote. If the content of history is the destiny of forms, and forms are an incomplete grasp of the law-like nature of the world, but a law-like character that transcends mere cause and effect, then are we to understand history as the completed grasp of such forms, their destiny fulfilled, as it were, and now revealing the previously elusive unity of integration? I don't know if that's what Jünger meant. This would be one way to interpret it, but it's clearly an aphorism that can only be unpacked in a more detailed reading, and that is all I'm going to say about it for the moment. So I've also discussed Jünger in my Wars and Rumors of Wars episode that I've mentioned several times, so if Jünger interests you, check that one out also. Happy birthday, Ernst Jünger, and thanks for listening.